Welcome. This is Dr. Owen Anderson, and we're continuing in David Hume's dialogues concerning natural religion. We're in part 7, and we've seen Philo undermine the method that Cleanthes uses to establish the knowledge of God. It's a method from analogy. And we're continuing now with Philo. In thinking about the ancient system of God as the mind of the world, I've just been struck with a new idea. If this is right, it comes close to subverting all your reasoning and destroying even the first inferences in which you place such confidence. If the universe resembles animal bodies and plants more than it does the works of human skill, it is more probable that its cause resembles the cause of the former than the cause of the latter. The former being plants, animal bodies, not human skill. So its origin ought to be ascribed to generation or vegetation rather than to reason or design. So imagine that maybe the universe is like an egg and it gets laid by a universe chicken. Or the universe is like asparagus and a seed falls and the universe grows. Maybe vegetation is what explains the universe, not being made by something. Now, Demia might start to see some problems here. He steps in. Please expand this argument a little, for I haven't properly grasped it. All right, so our friend Cleanthes, replied Philo, as you have heard, asserts that since no question of fact can be answered except through experience. Good. So in the last part, he identified Cleanthes' method. Now he's identifying Cleanthes' epistemology, which is empiricism. You know everything from experience. And so he's arguing from experience, design, to God. So the existence of God cannot be proven in any other way but by experience. The world, he says, resembles things made by human skill. And I note in passing that the operation of one very small part of nature, namely man, another very small part, namely inanimate matter lying within his reach, is the basis on which he judges everything. So in logic, it's called a hasty generalization. I met 3 students, they're all brilliant, therefore all students are brilliant. Now that's a safe conclusion at ASU. Right? But from just 3 things, you couldn't argue to the whole. You need more data, so to speak. That's one of his arguments. But then he says, if we're going to argue from parts to the whole, let us be careful about what parts we select. Instead of arguing from the human part, why not argue from the animal or plant part? The world plainly resembles an animal or a plant more than it does a watch or a knitting loom. Its cause is therefore likely similar to those. So we conclude that the cause of the world is something analogous to generation or vegetation. And really what he mentioned in part 6, the ancient theories, here he's getting into one of the ancient theories. This would be more like the mother God giving birth to universes rather than the father God creating universes. So these 2 views coming down through history. So how is it conceivable, said Demia, that the world can arise from anything similar to those, vegetation and generation? Very easily, replied Hume, or Philo. Here is one way it could happen. Just as a tree sheds its seeds into the neighboring fields and produces other trees, so the great plant, the world, or the planetary system, produces within itself certain seeds which it scatters into the surrounding chaos in which they grow into worlds. A comet, for instance, is the seed of a world. And after it's been fully ripened by passing from sun to sun and star to star, it at last tossed into the unformed elements which everywhere surround this universe and immediately sprouts into a new system. I think this is fascinating because in a previous part, he talked about aliens visiting Earth. Now, this is like the contemporary view of where things came from in 1776, right? DNA or amino acids on a meteorite landed on Earth and start everything. Well, here it is in Hume. Pre-science, I mean, this is the scientific age, but pre the level of astronomy we have now and familiarity we have now with meteorites or comets. And he's proposing through Philo, well, maybe that's the view. So one might suppose this will be an animal. That's the plant view. Or maybe a comet is an egg. And it crashes in the earth and it breaks open and out comes whatever was inside. Would that be like Godzilla or something like that? Nope. Mothra, one of those. I understand you, interrupted Demia, but what wild, arbitrary suppositions are these? See, now Demia is realizing, wait a minute, who have I tethered myself to? What data have you for such extraordinary conclusions? Is the slight imaginary resemblance of a world to a plant or animal sufficient to support conclusions about the world based on what happens with plants or animals? Ought objects that are in general so widely different taken to be the standard for each other? But maybe Demia is not quick. The thing I highlighted there is what Philo's saying. You can't argue from the limited experience of a human to where the universe came from. So he says, right. That's what I've been insisting on all along. I have gone on asserting that we have no data to establish any system of cosmogony, which is a theory of the origin of the world. Our experience, which is so imperfect in itself and which covers such small stretches of space and time, can't give us any probable conjecture concerning the whole of things. So Philo's view, he's not arguing for one or the other or a third. He's saying, we don't know. From experience, we can't know. But if we have to settle for some hypothesis, what's the rule? By what standard? Is there any rule except the one that bases the greater acceptability of a hypothesis on the greater similarity of the objects? And doesn't a plant or animal that arises from vegetation or generation resemble the world more closely than any artificial machine? So here he's saying, even if we do take Cleanthes' method, we just end up with the animal or vegetation model, not God. But what is this vegetation and generation of which you talk? Said Philo. Or Demia, sorry. Can you explain how they work and lay out the details of that fine internal structure on which they depend? I can do that, replied Philo, at least as well as Cleanthes can explain how reason works. So it's interesting here, Philo ends up setting himself against reason, but what he means by reason is more like clockwork or efficiency or pragmatic design that vegetation doesn't have. But there is a reason to vegetation when you study it. So it's more like mechanical reasoning of Cleanthes versus organic understanding. But I don't need to go into all that detail. It's enough for me that when I see an animal, I infer it rose from generation. I'm sure of this as you are about a house rose from design. And these seem to be merely labels of powers and energies in nature. We know the effects, but we have no grasp of their essence. And neither of them has a better claim on the whole than the other. In fact, Demia, we can reasonably expect that the wider the range of facts that we take in, the better they will guide us to our conclusion about extraordinary and magnificent objects. In this little corner of the world, there are four principles as like a driving force: reason, instinct, generation, and vegetation that are similar to each other and are the causes of similar effects. How many other principles can we naturally suppose to be at work in the immense extent and variety of the universe? So we may be familiar with these, but he's saying those may not be the only ones. There might be a lot more in the extent of the universe. This is only what we're familiar with. And any one of those four principles can give us a theory of the origin of the world and explain the other ones. And so if we're to go with reason, we're just being guilty of gross bias. If reason were more intelligible to us than the other three principles because it governs our minds, there would be some excuse for a bias in its favor, but that isn't how things stand. The internal structure of reason is really as little known to us as are the structures of instinct and vegetation. So our experience shows us that the effects of these principles, but the principles themselves and their ways of working, are totally unknown to us. So again, that's the reason to keep coming back to. We just don't know. Now, problem here is this. This is why I indicated earlier that he's using a specific definition of reason, because what he's done here is given an argument that he thinks is sound. And reason with a capital R is that by which you make arguments. So he's assuming reason in order to then raise questions about reason, which is problematic, right? We use reason to know that some things are totally unknown to us. How would we conclude that if reason itself is faulty? Then the conclusion, it might be a sound argument, but sound arguments only work in our corner of the universe. Everywhere else, unsound arguments work. And if belief in God is unsound, then everywhere else we should believe in God. So once you abandon reason, this all starts to fall apart. The critical approach also falls apart. So he says the world arising by vegetation from a seed shed from another world is no less intelligible or less in harmony with experience than to say the world arose from a divine plan. So how will Demea, the theist, handle that one? Well, but if the world did have a vegetative quality, said Demea, and could sow the seeds of new worlds into the infinite chaos, I would see this power as a further argument for design in its author. But where could such a wonderful power come from and not from design? How can order spring from anything other which doesn't perceive the order which it gives? So isn't this proof that there's a designer? This comet floating around, zipping around the universe with seeds, isn't that proof of a designer? Well, you only need to look around you, replied Philo, to get the answer to this question. A tree gives order and organization to the trees that arise from it without knowing that order. Similarly, with an animal and its offspring, a bird and its nest. So it's interesting here, this is called a non-cognitive knowing. Because you might say a bird, you probably would say a bird knows how to make a nest. But that doesn't mean propositionally that the bird could sit down next to you and explain it to you in birdish, because you recognize there's no such thing. So there's non-cognitive, non-propositional ways of knowing things. Probably riding a bike for you is like that. You may not be able to write an essay about how to ride a bike, but if I said, prove to me you can ride a bike, you just do it in front of me. And that's how trees know things. So really what's at stake here is this question: is the fundamental principle of reality cognitive or non-cognitive? That's reason as the logos or the anti-logos. And the analogies that Philo's giving are all anti-logos, non-cognitive, where the universe is more like a tree that just makes seeds. And if you say, put your hand around the tree, hey, buddy, how do you do that? That's pretty impressive. Unless it's an ent, and it isn't, it's not going to answer you, right? Not proposition. You might say, well, the wind blows through the leaves and I hear its voice. Well, that's a metaphor. It's not propositional language. If the wind blows through and then you start to hear, well, first I gather carbon from the ground. And I combine this with what? I get a recipe from the tree for, hey, the tree could be an Instagram influencer on how to the recipe for making seeds. So to assume that all this order in animals and plants proceeds ultimately from design is to assume the very point that it's at issue. Philo's saying that's a longer way of saying you're begging the question, Theanthus. Why do we have to have design? The only way to settle the point in favor of design would be to prove a priori, before experience, that order requires design. Furthermore, Demia, the object you have just brought can't be made by Cleanthes' objection unless he gives up a defense that he used against one of my objections. When I asked about the cause of the supreme reason, Cleanthes said, the supreme reason is it's self-existing, essentially. You don't explain ultimate causes. Okay, well, can't vegetation just be the ultimate cause? And you can't explain it? Can't we use the same principle? So there's no one's denying that there's order, just suggesting that perhaps it's from vegetation, not from reason. It is for me to choose whether to base my system of cosmology on the former rather than the latter. And that's a very important thing. Note this, because you might relate to that. Say, hey, my beliefs are up to me. Hands off. Yes, that's true, especially when you can't know. He's basically saying, hey, it's all a matter of opinion. We don't know. So I'll pick the one I like. You pick the one you like. That's the implication of skepticism. And you can't say one is better than the other. It's totally arbitrary. So when Cleanthes asks me, what's the cause of my vegetation? I'm equally entitled to ask him, what is the cause of the reasoning principle? Now, one place our mind might go is this. There are different kinds of causes. And some of them are self-explaining, and some of them aren't. So if you say of one of the not self-explaining ones, why not just start there? Well, that's your answer. So, well, how do you know it's not self-explaining? I'm not even sure you have to do an a priori argument. You could say, well, just from experience. But this is still what Philo would say. Yes, from your limited little human experience in this tiny corner of the universe. And that's always what's going to happen to empiricism. If you think all knowledge is based on your experience, you never really have knowledge. You have a tiny opinion based on a tiny amount of information in a vast universe, right? So if you're going to have any actual knowledge, it would have to come from reason. So now we get a part of what we see here is Philo's limited view of reason. For example, my reason, well, we were talking a minute ago about reason, capital R. When we shift to my reason, that's more like the verb, my reasoning. The way I think about things has a causal ancestry in my parents and their parents for them and their parents for them. That's where my reasoning came from. So every day we see reason arise from generation, but we never see generation arise from reason. So he thinks if we're going to go by argument from experience, we might stick with generation as the basic one. And so you can compare the consequences on both sides. So the world, I say, resembles an animal, so it's just an animal. The steps in that argument are jumps, I admit, but each one is smaller than the ones that Cleanthes requires to say the universe resembles a machine. So it's a machine. Those are jumps too, but they're larger. I have a better right to push one step further than his hypothesis by inferring that divine generation or God birth caused his principle of reason. I have empirical evidence on my side because reason is observed in countless causes to arise from generation. So Hume's reasoning arose from being born from his parents. But that'd be like saying math comes from being born from parents. Well, no, math's a thing in the world, right? There's like reason's a thing in the world, it doesn't come about. But my mathematical reasoning, yeah, that's true. You could do a history of Anderson's family's understanding of mathematics, right? That's very different from reason itself. So he notes that the ancient mythologists were so struck with this analogy that they all explain the origin of nature in terms of birth and population. Plato, too, as far as he is intelligible, I like that. Plato, as far as he's intelligible, seems to have adopted this notion in the Timaeus. So that's what the going view had been for a long time. The Brahmins, Hinduism, assert that the world arose from an infinitely large spider who spun this whole complicated mass from his bowels and then annihilates all or some of it by absorbing it again and taking it into his own essence. That's one of many Hindu analogies for the birth and death cycle of the universe. So even if we think this would be 1776 Scotland, that strikes us as ridiculous because a spider is a negligible little animal whose doings we are never likely to take for a model of the whole universe. That would be a literalist, not understanding a metaphor, right? A metaphor story to explain a cycle, and a literalist is like, no, that happens a lot. People who have literalist minds can't grasp images. Well, still, he says, even if you did think that, even for us on our planet, this is a new kind of analogy for us to think about. If there were, as there well might be, a planet wholly inhabited by spiders, this inference would seem there as natural and secure against criticisms as the ones that we use here. So we think it sounds absurd because of our limited time experience, but there may be another place that seems quite natural. And you can't impose what seems normal to you on others as if it's the universal standard. So I must say, Philo, replied Cleanthes, that the task you have undertaken of raising doubts and objections suits you better than it does anyone else alive. It seems in a way natural and unavoidable to you. You are so fertile in your inventions that I'm not ashamed to admit that I can't, straight off, solve in a detached way such out-of-the-way difficulties as you keep launching at. Though I clearly see it in general way they're wrong. So here he kind of dismisses Philo. These are just incidental, out-of-the-way objections. It's not really that important. It takes some time to go through each individual one, but in general, I can see they're wrong. I have no doubt that you are present in the same position as I am, not having any solution at hand to these objections. And you may be aware that common sense and reason are entirely against you, and that whimsical hypotheses like the ones you produce may puzzle, but can never convince us. So reason and common sense are entirely against you. Those are two different things. What we take to be common sense is usually relative to our society. And so in that way, Cleanthes is just falling into Philo's argument. Well, sure, common sense to your group, not to other groups. And then reason, we're gonna have to see, does Cleanthes help us define reason? So far he hasn't, and that's caused this ambiguity that Philo's working with. So we'll see if he can do any better in part 8. But then what's coming up as Cleanthes and Philo argue about these analogies is the problem of evil. That's going to really be the big objection to Cleanthes' position.